The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune as Sarah Mitchell pushed through the doors of St. Joseph's Medical Center for her second shift of the day. Her scrubs, freshly changed during her 30-minute break, still carried the faint scent of bleach from the hospital laundry. The night stretched ahead, another 12 hours before she could return to her sleeping children. In the break room locker, tucked behind her spare shoes, sat the photograph she couldn't bear to look at anymore. Her late husband Ryan, their twins Aiden and Olivia grinning gap-toothed at the camera, and herself, a version of herself that hadn't yet learned how heavy love could become. Sarah's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she checked vitals in room 347. Mrs. Dorothy Anderson, 92 years old, watched her with eyes that seemed to see beyond the clinical routine. The elderly woman had been a fixture on the cardiac unit for 3 weeks now, her condition stable but requiring constant monitoring. "You're here again," Dorothy observed, her voice carrying the refined accent of old Troy money. It wasn't a question. Sarah adjusted the drip, her movements betraying nothing of the exhaustion that lived in her bones. The mortgage payment was due in 4 days. Olivia needed new shoes for soccer. Aiden's asthma medication wasn't fully covered by insurance. Each expense was a weight, and she carried them all in the slope of her shoulders, the careful economy of her movements. She had learned to partition her mind during these double shifts. One part remained alert to medical needs, watching for changes in breathing patterns, monitoring for signs of distress. Another part calculated and recalculated their finances, searching for corners to cut, expenses to delay. The third part, the part she tried to keep locked away, remembered Ryan's laugh, the way he used to dance with the twins in the kitchen while dinner burned on the stove. The Mitchell family's roots in Troy ran deeper than most knew. Sarah's great-grandmother had been among the first nurses at the old Troy General Hospital, back when the city was transitioning from farmland to suburban prosperity. There was a photograph somewhere, Sarah had seen it once as a child, of her great-grandmother standing with a group of nurses outside a building that no longer existed. But there were other stories, whispered ones that Sarah had dismissed as family mythology. Stories about debts owed and promises made. About a wealthy family who had helped her great-grandmother when no one else would. An obligation that supposedly passed through generations like an inherited gene. Sarah's grandmother, Patricia, had been tight-lipped about her mother's work. Sarah remembered visiting her as a child, the small apartment that always smelled of lavender and antiseptic. Patricia had been a nurse too, though she'd retired early, claiming her back couldn't handle the strain. But sometimes, late at night when she thought Sarah was asleep, Patricia would receive phone calls that sent her out into the darkness with a medical bag she wasn't supposed to have. Some calls you answer no matter the hour. Patricia had said once when Sarah, barely 8, had caught her leaving. "Your great-grandmother taught me that. Someday, you'll understand." Sarah had never believed in such things. She believed in hard work, in the tangible reality of paychecks and bills. Fairy tales were luxuries she couldn't afford. But now, sitting in the break room during her mandated 15-minute rest, she found herself thinking about those midnight departures. About the women who would sometimes appear at Patricia's apartment, stay for a few days, then vanish. About the way her grandmother would look at her sometimes, as if measuring whether she had inherited more than just the Mitchell nose and stubbornness. Dorothy Anderson had no visitors. In 3 weeks, not a single person had come to see her. She had the best room on the floor, private, with a view of the small garden the hospital maintained, but she occupied it alone. Sarah had checked the records out of curiosity. Dorothy's emergency contact was a law firm in downtown Detroit. During the quiet hours of her night shifts, Sarah found herself drawn to room 347 more often than medical necessity required. Dorothy rarely slept, and she had a way of asking questions that peeled back layers Sarah didn't know existed. "Tell me about your children," Dorothy would say, and Sarah would find herself sharing more than she intended. Stories about Olivia's determination on the soccer field, how she played through bruised shins and exhaustion. About Aiden's gentle nature, the way he rescued insects from the house instead of killing them, how his asthma attacks terrified him, but he tried to be brave. Dorothy listened with an intensity that made Sarah uncomfortable. Sometimes she would nod, as if confirming something to herself, and make cryptic comments. "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree," she once murmured after Sarah described Olivia's stubborn streak. It was during her 4th week of double shifts that Sarah noticed the tremor in her hands. Just a slight shake as she tried to insert in 4, barely perceptible. She steadied herself against the bed rail, took a breath, and tried again. The needle found the vein on the 2nd attempt. Fatigue, she told herself. Nothing more. But the tremor returned the next night, and the next. She began timing her tasks to work around it, gripping supplies tighter, moving more deliberately. No one seemed to notice. The other nurses were too busy with their own patient loads, and the doctors barely looked at the nurses anyway. Dorothy noticed. "You're pushing too hard," the old woman said one night, her keen eyes following Sarah's slightly unsteady hands as she adjusted the monitor leads. Sarah forced a smile. "Just a little tired." "There's tired, and then there's what you're doing to yourself." Dorothy's tone carried an edge of something. Anger? Concern? What would happen to those children if you collapsed? The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah's hands stilled on the equipment. It was the fear that woke her at night, the thought that chased her through every exhausted hour. She was all Aiden and Olivia had left. If something happened to her. "I do what I have to do," Sarah said quietly. Dorothy's expression softened. "Yes, I suppose you do." Just like she did. Before Sarah could ask what she meant, Dorothy had closed her eyes, effectively ending the conversation. As autumn deepened in Troy, painting the suburbs in shades of gold and rust, Sarah began to notice patterns she had previously overlooked. Dorothy's medical chart showed admissions dating back years, always to St. Joseph's, always to the cardiac unit. The dates seemed random at first, but then Sarah realized they clustered around certain times, late October, early November. She pulled older records during a quiet moment, going back a decade, then 2. Dorothy Anderson had been coming to this hospital, to this specific unit, for 23 years. Always with the same condition, stable but requiring monitoring. Always alone. The dates nagged at her. October 28th through November 15th. Give or take a few days. Sarah cross-referenced them with calendar years, looking for patterns. Holidays? Anniversaries? Then she found it. A note in a file from 15 years ago, barely legible. Patient requested room 347 specifically. Became agitated when told it was occupied. Sarah's shift stretched long that night. She found herself in the archives, dust motes dancing in the fluorescent light as she pulled box after box of old records. The hospital had digitized most files, but the oldest ones remained in their original paper form, forgotten in the basement. It was there she found the admission record from 23 years ago. November 2nd. A man named James Anderson, age 35. Motor vehicle accident. Survived 3 hours in the cardiac unit before succumbing to internal injuries. Next of kin, Dorothy Anderson, mother. Currently abroad. The attending physician's notes were clinical, detached. But tucked behind them was something else, a handwritten note on hospital letterhead, signed by M. Mitchell, RN. Sarah's hands shook as she read her great-grandmother's careful script. Patient conscious until the end. Spoke of his daughter Jennifer, age 4. I assured him she would be cared for. Final words transcribed and sealed for family. Remained with patient until time of death at 3:47 a.m. We'll check on the child tomorrow. Room 347. 3:47 a.m. The synchronicity felt deliberate, meaningful in a way Sarah couldn't quite grasp. The mystery nagged at Sarah. She found herself thinking about it during the drive home, her mind too tired to maintain its usual compartments. Why would someone choose to spend weeks in a hospital when their condition didn't require it? What was Dorothy looking for? Now she knew. She was looking for a ghost, for a moment frozen in time, for the nurse who had given her son comfort in his final hours. The call came during Sarah's first shift on a Tuesday. Olivia's school. There had been an incident on the soccer field. Olivia had collapsed during practice. She was conscious, the administrator assured Sarah, but they recommended she be seen by a doctor. The words echoed in Sarah's mind as she walked quickly down the hospital corridor. Collapsed. The same word the doctors had used when Ryan's heart gave out on that construction site 3 years ago. The same helplessness flooding through her veins. The same prayer on her lips. Not again. Please, not again. Sarah's hands shook as she found her supervisor. She had no sick days left, had used them all when Aiden's asthma flared up in September. Taking time off meant losing hours, losing pay they desperately needed. Go, her supervisor said, seeing something in Sarah's face that brooked no argument. We'll manage. At the urgent care clinic, Olivia sat on the examination table, still in her soccer uniform, grass stains on her knees. She looked small and defiant, reminding Sarah painfully of Ryan. I'm fine, Olivia insisted. I just got dizzy. The doctor's examination revealed what Sarah had feared. Olivia was showing signs of malnutrition. Not severe, not yet, but enough to cause concern. Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She had been so careful with their meals, stretching every dollar, making sure the twins ate even when she survived on hospital cafeteria leftovers. But it hadn't been enough. That night, Sarah returned for her second shift because she had no choice. The urgent care visit would add to their bills. She needed every hour of pay she could get. Olivia was home with Mrs. Kowalski from next door, under strict instructions to rest and eat the soup Sarah had hastily prepared. Dorothy was awake when Sarah entered room 347, as if she had been waiting. How is your daughter? Dorothy asked without preamble. Sarah's professional mask slipped. How did you? Nurses talk. Even old patients have ears. Dorothy's expression was unreadable. Sit down, Sarah. You look ready to fall over. I can't. I have rounds. Sit. The command in Dorothy's voice was absolute. Sarah found herself sinking into the visitor's chair before she consciously decided to obey. Dorothy studied her for a long moment. Do you know why I come here every year? Sarah shook her head. I'm looking for someone. Have been for 23 years. Dorothy's fingers plucked at the hospital blanket. My son, my only child, died in this hospital. Car accident. He was 35, married, with a young daughter. His wife was killed instantly, but he lived for 3 hours. Long enough to make it here, to this unit. Sarah remained silent, sensing there was more. A nurse stayed with him the entire time. Held his hand while he died. I was in Europe, couldn't get back in time. This nurse, she took down his last words, made sure he wasn't alone. She went to check on my granddaughter afterward, made sure she was safe with the neighbors until I arrived. Dorothy's eyes fixed on Sarah with uncomfortable intensity. I never got to thank her properly. By the time I was coherent enough to look for her, she had moved on. All I knew was that she worked in this unit, that she had the most compassionate eyes I'd ever described to me. Sarah's great-grandmother's name had been Margaret. She remembered that suddenly, the memory surfacing from some deep place. Margaret Mitchell, who had worked at Troy General before it merged with St. Joseph's, who had raised Sarah's grandmother alone after her husband died in a factory accident. What was the nurse's name? Sarah asked, though part of her already knew. Dorothy shook her head. I never learned it. The hospital records from that time are incomplete. But I know she had a daughter. My son mentioned it in his last words. Said the nurse told him about her little girl to comfort him, to let him know his daughter would be okay. That children are resilient. Sarah's throat felt tight. Why do you keep coming back? At first, to find her. Then, as the years passed, it became something else. A pilgrimage, maybe. A way to honor my son's memory and the kindness of a stranger. Dorothy's smile was sad. The hospital staff think I'm a hypochondriac with good insurance. They're not entirely wrong. She reached for the bedside table, pulling out a manila envelope Sarah hadn't noticed before. I had my lawyers draw this up last week. I've been waiting for the right moment. Sarah took the envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a legal document, dense with terminology she didn't immediately understand. But certain phrases jumped out. Trust fund, full tuition, medical expenses, Aiden and Olivia Mitchell. I can't accept this, Sarah said automatically. You don't have a choice, Dorothy replied. It's already done. The trust is established and funded. Your children are the beneficiaries. But why? You don't even know if I'm related to the nurse who helped my son? Dorothy's smile was knowing. Sarah, I've watched you for weeks. The way you treat every patient with dignity, even when you're dead on your feet. The way you talk about your children, with that mix of fierce love and constant worry. The way you push yourself past all reasonable limits because you have no other choice. She reached out, her papery hand covering Sarah's trembling one. Maybe you're her great-granddaughter. Maybe you're not. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you're here, doing the same work, making the same sacrifices. The cycle continues. Sarah tried to refuse. She spent the next 3 days in a haze of disbelief, consulting the legal documents, speaking with Dorothy's lawyers, attempting to return what felt like an impossible gift. But Dorothy had been thorough. The trust was irrevocable, the terms clear. Aiden and Olivia's education would be paid for from elementary school through college. Medical expenses covered. A monthly stipend for living costs. It's not charity, Dorothy insisted during one of their conversations. It's balance. A debt repaid, or perhaps a debt passed forward. Your great-grandmother gave my family the gift of compassion when we needed it most. Let me return it. Sarah cried then, for the first time since Ryan's funeral. Great, gasping sobs that shook her entire body. Dorothy held her hand and said nothing, understanding that sometimes grief and relief are indistinguishable. With the immediate pressure of survival lifted, Sarah found herself able to think clearly for the first time in months. She reduced her hours to a single shift, spent evenings helping Olivia with homework instead of calculating bills. Aiden's asthma improved when she had time to properly manage his medications and triggers. But questions remained. She searched for records of her great-grandmother, following a trail that led through hospital archives and genealogy websites. What she found complicated the simple story she had always believed. Margaret Mitchell had indeed worked at Troy General in the 1970s. But she had also been connected to several prominent families in the area, appearing in society photographs at charity events, her name mentioned in connection with various philanthropic efforts. There were gaps in the record, periods where Margaret seemed to disappear entirely, only to resurface months later. Sarah's mother, Jennifer, named after a cousin she'd always been told, proved surprisingly unhelpful when questioned. Grandma Margaret didn't talk about her work much, Jennifer said over coffee one Sunday afternoon. She was private about that part of her life. Said some stories weren't hers to tell. But Jennifer did have boxes. Boxes of photographs, letters, documents that had been gathering dust in her attic since Margaret's death 15 years ago. Sarah spent entire evenings sorting through them, looking for clues to the woman her great-grandmother had been. She found pay stubs showing irregular employment patterns. Photographs of Margaret with women Sarah didn't recognize, often taken in what looked like safe houses or temporary shelters. And then, buried at the bottom of one box, she found a leather journal. Its pages were filled with initials and dates, cryptic notations in Margaret's precise handwriting. LB, March 1973, Cleveland. SM, June 1974, new identity secured. DA, October 1974, shelter arranged, Troy. DA Dorothy Anderson. In a box of old photographs at her mother's house, Sarah found what she had been looking for without knowing it. A picture of Margaret standing with a young woman outside Troy General. The woman's face was partially obscured, but her posture, the way she held herself, was eerily familiar. On the back, in Margaret's careful handwriting, with Dorothy, 1971. But there was more. Sarah discovered a series of letters, never sent, addressed to D. They spoke of gratitude, of secrets kept, of a debt that could never be repaid. One line stood out: "You gave me a second chance when the world would have destroyed me. I pray someday I can return the favor." Sarah brought the photograph to the hospital on a quiet Thursday evening. Dorothy was scheduled for discharge the next morning, her annual pilgrimage complete. She looked frilier than when she had arrived, as if confession had taken something from her. "You knew," Sarah said, placing the photograph on the bedside table. "You knew who I was from the beginning." Dorothy picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. "I suspected. The resemblance is strong, not just physical, but something deeper. The way you carry yourself, that particular combination of strength and gentleness. But why the charade? Why not just tell me? Would you have believed me? Would you have accepted help if I had walked in here and announced I wanted to give your children a fortune because your great-grandmother was kind to my family 50 years ago?" Dorothy shook her head. "You would have thought I was senile. Besides, I needed to be sure." "Sure of what?" "That the legacy continued. That Margaret's compassion had been passed down through the generations." Dorothy handed the photograph back. "I wasn't disappointed." On her last night before discharge, Dorothy told Sarah one final story. "Your great-grandmother saved more than just my family," she said. During the 70s, there was an informal network of women, nurses, social workers, teachers. They helped other women in trouble. Quietly, without fanfare. Women who couldn't go to their families, who had nowhere else to turn. Sarah thought of the gaps in Margaret's employment record, the periods of absence. She was helping them, hiding them, sometimes, finding them new lives when necessary. It was dangerous work, especially then. But Margaret believed that compassion required action, not just feeling. Dorothy's eyes were distant, remembering. "I was one of those women once. Before I married into the Anderson family. Before I became respectable." The revelation hung between them, heavy with implication. "My son never knew," Dorothy continued. "I crafted a careful life, a perfect facade. But Margaret knew the truth, and she kept my secret even from her own family. When my son died, when I saw her name on the old duty rosters, I thought perhaps it was fate, a chance to repay a debt that could never truly be repaid." After Dorothy's discharge, Sarah found herself at a crossroads. The financial security the trust provided meant she could make choices based on something other than desperate need. She could return to school, pursue the nurse practitioner degree she had abandoned when Ryan got sick. She could work normal hours, be present for her children in ways she hadn't been able to before. But there was another option, one that whispered to her during quiet moments. She thought of her great-grandmother's secret work, of the women who still needed help, who still had nowhere to turn. The network Margaret had been part of no longer existed, but the need remained. Sarah began quietly. A young nurse fleeing an abusive relationship needed a place to stay. Sarah offered her guest room. A patient without insurance needed medications. Sarah found ways to help that bent, but didn't break regulations. She discovered that compassion, like debt, could be passed forward indefinitely. The first woman she helped was named Beth. 23 years old, fresh out of nursing school, with bruises hidden under carefully applied makeup and a story about falling downstairs that no one believed. Sarah recognized the look in her eyes. She'd seen it in the mirror after Ryan's death, that combination of desperation and determination. "I don't have anywhere else to go," Beth had whispered during a quiet moment in the supply closet. "My family, they think he's perfect. They won't believe me." Sarah thought of Margaret's journal, of the entries about women with nowhere to turn. She made a decision that felt both sudden and inevitable. "You'll stay with us," Sarah said, "for as long as you need." Beth lived in their basement for 3 months. She helped with the children, cooked meals when Sarah worked late, slowly pieced herself back together. When she finally left, it was for a job in Colorado, far from her ex-husband's reach. She sent Christmas cards every year after, pictures of her new life, her eventual family. Word spread, as word always does. Sarah never advertised, never spoke openly about what she did. But somehow, women in need found their way to her. a resident who needed to hide from a stalker, a janitor whose immigration status was used as a weapon by an abusive employer, a fellow nurse whose addiction recovery was threatened by a dealer who wouldn't let her go. Each woman who passed through Sarah's house left something behind, not just gratitude, but a promise to help someone else when the time came, to pass forward what they had received. The network Dorothy had spoken of began to rebuild itself, organic and invisible. Aidan and Olivia noticed the change in their mother. Not just the reduced exhaustion, the presence at dinner, but something deeper. A purpose that went beyond survival. "Mom's different," Olivia observed one evening, watching Sarah sort through resources for a women's shelter she had begun volunteering with. "Good different," Aidan added, his breathing easy and unlabored thanks to the new treatment regimen they could now afford. They had also noticed the women who sometimes stayed in their guest room, the quiet conversations that stopped when they entered, the way their mother had begun keeping certain phone numbers written on paper instead of saved in her phone. But they understood, in the way children always understand more than adults think they do, that this was important work. Sacred work, even. 6 months after Dorothy's departure, Sarah received a package from the law firm. Inside was a leather journal, its pages filled with names and dates going back decades. Some entries were in Margaret's handwriting, others in scripts Sarah didn't recognize. Dorothy's letter was brief. "This was your great-grandmother's true legacy. The money I've given your children is just paper and numbers. This record of lives saved, of compassion and action, is the real inheritance. Use it wisely." Sarah understood. The journal wasn't just a record, it was a roadmap. Many of the women named in its pages had gone on to positions of influence, careers in medicine, law, social work. They were out there still, an invisible network waiting to be reactivated. She thought of Dorothy, returning year after year to a hospital room, searching for a ghost of kindness. She thought of Margaret, risking everything to help strangers. She thought of Aidan and Olivia, growing up in a world that would need such networks more than ever. The journal contained more than names. There were procedures, protocols written in various hands. How to create new identities in the pre-digital age. Which churches would provide sanctuary without questions. Which doctors would treat injuries without filing reports. It was a manual for an underground railroad that had operated in plain sight. One entry caught Sarah's eye. Dorothy Anderson's full story, written in Margaret's hand. October 1974. D. Arrived 7 months pregnant, bruises fading but spirit broken. Husband powerful, connected. Divorce impossible. Helped her disappear for 2 months, establish new identity. Baby born healthy, November 15th. D. Returned to husband with story of breakdown, retreat for mental health. He believed it. Child given to sister to raise. D. Plays the part of perfect wife now, but she is free inside. She knows she can leave when ready. Sometimes prison doors are kept locked by fear, not keys. Sarah sat back, pieces falling into place. Dorothy's son James, born November 15th, raised by an aunt, never knowing his mother's true story. The dates of Dorothy's hospital visits suddenly made terrible sense. She came every year around the anniversary of giving up her firstborn child and stayed through the anniversary of his death. The choice was already made. 5 years later, Sarah stood in the same cardiac unit, now as a nurse practitioner. The trust had paid for her education, but she had chosen to return to St. Joseph's. Some debts, she had learned, were best honored through service. Olivia, now 17 and headed for pre-med, volunteered at the hospital on weekends. She had her great-great-grandmother's eyes, that particular combination of strength and gentleness that marked the Mitchell women. Aidan, 15 and finally outgrowing his asthma, talked about becoming a social worker. The network Sarah had rebuilt operated quietly but effectively. Women in crisis found help through whispered recommendations, careful referrals. The official resources were better now than in Margaret's time, but the gaps remained. Sometimes what someone needed most was a safe place to sleep, a meal without questions, a hand to hold while they made impossible choices. Sarah kept Dorothy's room, 347, under special watch. She had never returned after that final stay, but sometimes Sarah felt her presence, especially during the late shifts when exhaustion made the boundaries between past and present permeable. The photograph of Margaret and Dorothy sat on Sarah's desk at home, a reminder that some debts transcended money, that some inheritances couldn't be counted in dollars. Next to it sat the journal, its pages now containing new names, new stories of survival and secret kindness. One night, as Sarah was preparing to leave after her shift, a young nurse approached her. New to the unit, scared, carrying a bruise she had tried to cover with makeup. "I heard," the nurse said hesitantly, "that you sometimes help people. Women who are in trouble." Sarah thought of Margaret, of Dorothy, of all the women whose names filled the journal. She thought of Aidan and Olivia, safe at home, their futures secured by an old woman's gratitude and a great-grandmother's courage. "Yes," Sarah said simply. "I do." The cycle continued, as it always had, as it always would. Love and sacrifice, debt and repayment, all of it flowing through generations like blood through veins, keeping the heart of compassion beating. In room 347, the monitors beeped steadily, watching over an empty bed that had once held so many secrets. Sarah touched the doorframe as she passed, a gesture that had become habit, or perhaps ritual. Somewhere in Troy, in the sprawling suburbs where prosperity masked 1,000 private struggles, another woman was learning what the Mitchell family had always known, that the weight of love was heavy, but it was a weight that could be shared, passed forward, transformed into something larger than any individual sacrifice. The night shift continued. The work went on. And in the spaces between heartbeats, between the official records and the public face of charity, the real inheritance of Margaret Mitchell lived on, not in trust funds or legal documents, but in the simple act of one woman helping another survive another day. Sarah Mitchell had learned the final lesson of her inheritance, that some debts could never be fully repaid, and that was precisely the point. They were meant to be passed on, transformed, multiplied. Each act of kindness creating another, each sacrifice enabling someone else's survival, until the original gift became impossible to trace, as essential and invisible as breath itself. The story had no ending because such stories never truly end. They continue in whispered conversations in hospital corridors, in safe houses that appear on no official registry, in the careful networks that spring up wherever compassion meets necessity. And in room 347 of St. Joseph's Medical Center, where an old woman once searched for a ghost and found instead a living legacy, the empty bed waited for the next chapter to begin. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by courier to Sarah's office at St. Joseph's. The return address was a law firm, but not Dorothy's. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened it. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, my name is Jennifer Anderson Walsh. You knew my grandmother, Dorothy Anderson, who passed away peacefully in her sleep last Thursday. I am writing because she left instructions that you should be informed immediately upon her death, and because there are matters requiring your attention. More importantly, I am writing because I have questions only you can answer." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of another secret settling on her shoulders. She thought of the journal, now hidden in her own home, filled with new names and stories. She thought of the network she had rebuilt, the women she had helped, the secrets she now carried. The letter continued. "My grandmother left me her personal effects, including a photograph of a nurse named Margaret Mitchell and a woman I now know was my grandmother, though younger than I ever saw her. She also left me a cryptic message. The debt is paid, but the work continues. Sarah will explain. I don't understand what she meant. I didn't even know she had been hospitalized in recent years. She told us her annual retreats were to a spa in Arizona. Now I learned she spent weeks at St. Joseph's every November, and that she established a trust fund for your children. There's more. Among her papers, I found references to a safety deposit box and a note that said Sarah has the key. I have no idea what this means. Please, Ms. Mitchell, I need to understand who my grandmother really was." Sarah looked at the calendar. November 2nd. 28 years to the day since James Anderson died in room 347. She reached for her phone, then stopped. This wasn't a conversation for telephone or text. Some truths required presence, the weight of shared space. She thought of the safety deposit box she had opened 5 years ago, the documents inside that had stunned her into silence. Birth certificates with names that could be changed. Contact information for a network of safe houses across the country, some still operational. Cash and small bills. And photographs. Dozens of women Margaret had helped, their real names written on the back in pencil, easily erased if necessary. Most shocking had been the letter addressed to my Heir in this work, written in Margaret's careful hand. If you are reading this, then the network continues. Use these resources wisely. Trust sparingly but completely. Remember that every woman you save may save 10 others. The work is never finished, but neither is the hope. Sarah wrote back to Jennifer. Dear Jennifer, your grandmother was one of the bravest women I have ever known. The story is long and complex, but you deserve to hear it. All of it. Can you meet me at the hospital tomorrow? There's someone else who should be part of this conversation, my daughter Olivia. She's 18 now, preparing for medical school, and it's time she learned the full history of the women who came before her. The work your grandmother spoke of does continue. It must. And perhaps it's time for the next generation to take up the mantle. Room 347 will be empty tomorrow afternoon. It seems the appropriate place to bring the story full circle. As for the key, yes, I have it. What it unlocks is both a history and a future. Bring your courage, Jennifer. You're going to need it. As Sarah sealed the letter, she thought of Margaret, who had kept Dorothy's secret even from her own family. She thought of Dorothy, who had turned her grief into a gift that would educate dozens of children. She thought of all the women whose names filled the journal, some who had needed help, others who had provided it, most who had done both. The thread that connected them all wasn't blood or obligation. It was choice. The choice to see suffering and act. The choice to carry secrets that weren't theirs to share. The choice to transform personal pain into communal healing. Outside her office window, Troy sprawled in all its suburban prosperity. But Sarah knew the truth that Margaret had known, that Dorothy had discovered, that she now carried. Beneath the manicured lawns and shopping centers, there were always those who needed help and those willing to provide it. The network was eternal, adapting to each generation's needs but never disappearing. Tomorrow, she would tell Jennifer about her grandmother's courage. She would introduce her to Olivia, let the young women discover their shared inheritance. She would open the safety deposit box again, show them the tools of a secret trade that had saved countless lives. Perhaps Jennifer would join the network, or perhaps she would simply understand and keep the secret. Either way, the story would continue. Sarah touched the journal on her desk, thinking of the newest entry she had added just that morning. A teacher from Birmingham, fleeing with her children. A safe house arranged. New identities being crafted. The same old story in modern dress. The weight of love, Sarah had learned, never grew lighter. It simply became more familiar, like a backpack worn so long it felt like part of your body. You learn to move with it, to dance despite its weight, to find strength in the very thing that might have crushed you. In the cardiac unit, the evening shift was beginning. Young nurses checked vitals, adjusted medications, offered comfort to the afraid and alone. Some of them, Sarah knew, would one day carry their own secrets, make their own sacrifices, join the invisible network that had existed long before Margaret Mitchell and would exist long after they were all gone. She thought of the meeting tomorrow, of the moment when she would hand Jennifer the key her grandmother had carried for 50 years. She thought of Olivia's face when she learned the full truth about her heritage. She thought of the next name she would add to the journal, and the next, and the next. The work continued. It always had. It always would. And in room 347, where love and loss had intersected so many times, where debts were paid and new obligations born, the empty bed waited patiently for the next story to begin. Tomorrow, it would witness another passing of the torch, another link forged in an endless chain of compassion. But tonight, it stood empty and expectant, holding space for all the secrets yet to be told, all the women yet to be saved, all the sacrifices yet to be made in the name of love.